Welcome to this SSG Training for Competency module. During this module, we're going to be focusing on the understanding and management of children and young people with SEND, special educational needs and disabilities. Before we get into the detail of this module, we're just going to run through a few slides which will explain the bigger picture of our Training for Competency concept and how it fits into the whole further development of our staff here at SSG. When looking at how best to provide training and competency for our staff within SSG activities and active care, we've settled on the following three category areas. We have the activity delivery ability. So that would be where you would learn about a specific activity or group of activities and how best to deliver those to a high quality, safely, and with best practice. We look at project knowledge. So making sure that you are fully prepared when you're going into one of any of our specific projects. And then we have the wider policy understanding and application. An example here would be the wider safeguarding policy, health and safety, and many others that make sure that you have the underpinning foundation to do your jobs appropriately and well. It's really critical to us at SSG that all staff members are striving to improve themselves through personal development. There's a number of ways that staff can do this, including taking part in these training for competency modules. Doing the job and striving for self-improvement is really important. Undertaking shadow sessions. The more you see, the better you'll understand. And working with more experienced or staff with different knowledge is a great way to develop yourself. Speak to other SSG staff who have appropriate experience to advise you. Remember, it's important that you pick the right people and they know what they're talking about. And you can book yourself into other relevant national government body courses or other external training. And we have a large portfolio of these available to our staff. It's important to remember that your self-development will improve the quality of job you can do, but also it will improve the wide range of activities and projects that you can access. And the more you can do at SSG, then the more work you can get and the more money you can earn. At the end of every training for competency module, we will ask you to undertake a competency assessment. This could be a short questionnaire to show that you've listened to and understood the information in the presentation, or it could be a practical observation by a senior member of the team, just to see that you are capable of undertaking practical leadership. It could also be a combination of both, depending on the module. We've categorized our delivery into 4 phases, and this makes up the activities delivery pyramid. At the very foundation of everything that we do, we are looking to educate and develop children and young people's foundation and core skills and values. We'll look at this a little bit more in a slide shortly. Phase 2 is then building on this and looking to deliver meaningful physical activity and play. When we say meaningful, we're looking at children and young people engaging in the activity and taking something extra away through learning and enjoyment. Phase 3 looks at developmental, so technical and tactical skills. This is where projects like our sports academies and swim schools start to come into play, where we are looking at working the children through set criteria of skill development and assessing them along their journey so that we can award and reward them to show their achievement and progression. And then the final phase, phase 4, is where we're looking at educational physical literacy. And physical literacy looks at developing the heart, the head, and the hands. So the hands, we're looking at the practical doing, building on phase 3 around the developmental, tactical, and technical skills. Then we're taking it a level further. we're ensuring that we're embedding in the head a absolute understanding and importance for taking part in any form of physical activity. And then the heart is about developing their understanding and their physical fitness. So we want children and young people to leave those sessions with an absolute understanding that if they take part in physical activity, sport and PE lessons, they are going to get fitter, and they need to know the reasons that is important for their long-term health. All of our projects fit into one or more of these phases, but we never have one phase without the others that sit below them on the pyramid. When we think about the first phase of our pyramid and delivering character education and values, this is about making good people and setting good examples. We say that we want every young person and child that works with us to leave a session and leave a program having built better internal fibre. So on the screen here you can see just a few of what them things could be, and these are the behaviorisms that we are looking to encourage and reward through every single session and project that we do with every single young person who comes into contact with SSG. This slide identifies the outcomes we want you to have achieved by the end of the module presentation. There's 5 specific outcomes for this module. Please take a moment to have a read through them, both at the beginning of the presentation and then revisit this at the end to check your learning. This definition of SEND is taken from the SEND Code of Practice, which is guidance on the laws which affect SEND. Take a moment just to read through and digest what it is saying. Make a note of any questions for the end of the presentation that you may want to ask and clarify your learning. Again, this slide is just one for you to have a read through at your own time and to reflect on the information it's given you. As you will see from the figures and the data that's in this slide, that the number of SEND young people and children is on the increase in the UK, and it gives you a few interesting statistics that you'll be able to come back to after the end of the presentation, which should mean a little bit more to you. Here we can see the 4 areas that we categorize SEND into. We have communication and interaction, cognitive and learning, sensory and or physical needs, social, emotional and mental health difficulties. It's important to remember that a child or a young person can have multiple conditions that could be in one or more of these 4 categories. The following 4 slides will look at each of these categories in a little bit more detail. We haven't added audio for each of these 4 slides to follow, but what we'd like you to do is take your own time in reading them, taking notes for at the end of the presentation around any specific questions that you may have. We hope you found the previous 5 slides interesting and you've been able to take time to digest the information within them. This should give everyone a really good foundation for understanding special educational needs and disabilities and how they are categorized and what falls into each of the 4 categories when thinking about SEND. We're now going to spend a little time working through a few of the more common conditions and the kind of things that you'll come into contact with when you're working with young people and children within SSG. The first condition we're going to talk about is the autism spectrum disorder, or known as the ASD for short. This condition is a developmental disability, so it's a difference in how the brain works. Autism is not a learning disability, but around half of the people with autism may also have a learning disability, which will affect the level of support they need in their life. When we talk about a spectrum, we talk about a wide ranging in differences. So we're going to see a great deal of different behaviours and needs when dealing with young people and children with ASD. Things that you may experience when dealing with children and young people with ASD can include things like difficulty understanding facial expressions or tones of voice. They don't always understand jokes or sarcasm. There's also a difficulty interacting with others. They find social situations difficult to cope with. There's a difficulty in communicating with others. This can sometimes lead to frustration and a tendency to shy away from being around other individuals. They just experience the world around them very differently, and this can often lead to differences in behaviour than you may see from your mainstream children and young people. They often prefer rigid and repetitive behaviours, and rules become particularly important. They can get distressed very easily if these rules and boundaries are not adhered to. So it's really important to know, if you're working with a child or a young person with autism, that what is the rules that they need to be following, and how are you going to ensure that they're implemented. A specific form of autism is the Asperger's syndrome. So this affects the way in which an individual communicate and relate to other people. So when typically we come across people with Asperger's syndrome, we find that they don't have a learning disability, and that they can often have an above or an average intelligence level. They will have fewer problems with speech than some other children and young people with autism. They still have difficulties with understanding and processing language. This is important to bear this in mind when you're working with any young person or child with Asperger's syndrome. It often comes as a shock when we talk about the fact that around 1 in 10 people in the UK have some degree of dyslexia. What this tends to mean is that these individuals read and write much slower than the other 9 individuals without this condition. They often confuse the order of letters in words, and they put them the wrong way around, and have a poor or inconsistent spelling. This can lead to lots of frustrations, especially with younger children who are just learning to deal with this. They often understand information when told verbally, but have difficulty with information that's written down. This is a really important and key point to remember if you're dealing with someone with dyslexia. They often struggle with planning and organisation, so you need to be really clear and concise, and sometimes maybe repetitive if you're giving them instructions or asking them to think about how to organise or plan an activity or an event. People with dyslexia often have good skills in other areas, such as creative thinking and problem solving, and generally have high intelligence. And there's a lot of famous and very successful people in the world who have this condition. So it really doesn't have to act as a barrier to any form of inclusion, development or progression for these young people and children that you're working with. When we think about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or commonly known as ADHD, what we tend to generally find is that the individual has real difficulty staying focused and paying attention. They also have difficulty controlling behaviour and their hyperactivity. Wherever we know that we've got a child or a young person with this condition, it's really important to keep the information that you're providing them brief and focused and short in duration. And the same with the activities and tasks that we're giving them. If we can keep things moving and changing and keeping them on task, you'll have much less problems with behaviour than if you give them long, drawn out information and leave them for too long without giving them any change in challenge or activity. When thinking about an auditory processing disorder or APD, there is a hearing problem where the brain is unable to process sounds in a normal way. How this then translates into frustrations for the individual is that they may experience a difficulty understanding speech. This can particularly occur if there is more than one person speaking, the person is speaking quickly, or the sound quality is poor from the person speaking. They'll also struggle to distinguish similar sounds from one another. Examples of this are shoulder versus soldier or cold versus cold. So just think about what words you're using next to each other in a sentence structure and try your best to avoid this kind of scenario. They'll also struggle to concentrate when there's background noise. So this will lead to difficulty understanding and remembering instructions, as well as difficulty speaking clearly and problems with reading and writing if there's a lot of noise going on around them. Just think about the environment that they're in and what you can do to minimize the noise that they're hearing. When encountering a young person or child with Down syndrome, you tend to typically find that they have some level of learning disability. And this also has a characteristic physical feature. There are some health problems associated with Down syndrome, such as a heart problem and difficulties with sight and hearing. But these will not affect everyone with the condition. As with all of the conditions that we've talked about, it's really important to learn how to effectively manage the condition. As we said earlier, no two children with SEND will be the same, and often these children and young people will have multiple barriers or issues caused from one or more of the 4 categories we looked at earlier. We're going to talk now about how you can learn about and manage the SEND confidently. There are 3 fundamental elements for you to be able to manage a special education need or disability confidently and effectively. We've categorized these as knowledge and understanding, attitude and philosophy, and experience and behavior management. I'm just going to take a little moment over the next few slides to look at each of these 3 individually. To acquire knowledge and understanding specific to special education needs and disability, it takes effort and it takes a little time. Some of the key strategies that are in place to help you develop your knowledge and understanding include the following steps. SSG have a children and young person essential information form. This is very detailed around young people and children who have SEND. So this is your first protocol. Make sure if you're working with any child or young person with SEND, you're reading this form and you're understanding what it's saying and how to apply it. This is really important. Alongside this may be an education and healthcare plan. These are provided externally to SSG if the child has one. They may not always have one, but they often do. This is quite a detailed document and is summarised in the first form that we talked about, the essential information form. But if you want to find more out about the child or children you're working with, take time to have a read of these and ask any questions of a more experienced member of the team if you aren't sure what the information is telling you. Training and personal development is critical. This module is part of the training that we will provide alongside other internal and external training opportunities. You can do an awful lot more by just going out and researching via websites about special educational needs, the different conditions and how they are affecting the children and young people, and effective techniques for working with them. And then finally, get to understand the child or young person. It is always a case of trial and error. So if you read something or hear something in the stage that we just talked about through training and personal development, don't assume it's just going to work. You might need to try a few different things until you find an effective strategy. But by doing all 4 of these steps, with a bit of time and effort, you will start to really become very confident in the knowledge and understanding around SEND. A really critical piece of information is a differentiation action plan. These action plans should exist for any child attending a SSG program or provision who has a SEND condition. This tells you in a broken down format, specifically and individually to the child, using the child's name, a little bit about them and their assessment and the barriers and needs that they have, and then also the actions or action plan of what we need to be doing to ensure they're getting the best care and the most meaningful experiences that they can. This document isn't written once and not added to. It should be reviewed after every visit, updated with new information if something has changed or we find or learn something new about the child or young person. It's what we call a working document and isn't there to sit neatly and tidily just in a folder. It needs to be being used every time the child or young person is in contact with SSG. Having the right attitude and philosophy is a core belief in everything that takes place at SSG, and working with SEND children and young people is no different. It is critical that we promote inclusion and we find ways to make sure that every child and young person can get involved in every activity that takes place. This is achieved through many ways and great thinking from you being creative and bold. We also have to think about acceptance. You have to accept that children with SEND are going to have these barriers and we have to work with them. Differentiation, as we mentioned in the previous slide, is critical. Documenting what works and finding ways to change, adapt, and work around whatever the barriers are. And these 3 things only come with a can-do attitude. The minute we become defeatist, then we're no longer effective. And that leads to making sure that we apply equality and fairness and we treat every child and young person absolutely 100% the same, no matter what their differences might be. The final 2 elements of absolute success when you're managing young people and children with SEND are experience and effective behaviour management. We all know that experience only comes through doing. So you've got to be involved. Key strategies are to share best practice, talk to each other and talk to lead practitioners. Watch and observe other staff See what they're doing. Does it work? Could it work for you? Reflect on what's worked and also what didn't. If you're trying different things, as we talked about earlier in the presentation, some things are not going to work. Accept that, move on. And then communication. You must document and you must share. If you find something that is fantastic and you keep it to yourself, that's really not being part of the team. Be open and be honest and be bold to share. There's no wrong answers. When we talk about behaviour management, quite often when we talk about SEND, people get very nervous. We must treat children with disabilities exactly the same as we treat children without. However, there are some additional things we can do on top of our existing behaviour management. And you need to refresh and apply our core behaviour management strategies to when you're working with SEND. Just be aware of the sensory management, the things around the language and the tone and the sentence structure and how quickly you're speaking. That doesn't mean you avoid telling a child if they're doing something not quite right and what your expectation is. But you may just need to think about how you say it and also where and when you say it. You need to use eye contact. It's really important, particularly if the child has attention issues or sensory issues. They need to know you're talking to them. That might need you to take them to a quiet space without distraction. Simple sentence structures we mentioned in the sensory management. Keep this core to what you're saying. And in confirmation and consistency, you need to make sure that they understand, and you need to understand them. You need them to understand when you're finished so that they can move on. Sometimes with mainstream children, you can just smile to let them know that's it, the end of things. But with children with SEND, they may need a much stronger confirmation that the issue is resolved and we're moving on with their behaviour. We hope that you found the presentation helpful. There's an awful lot of detail in this particular training for competency presentation, so it may need you to revisit it on numerous occasions and refer back to it as and when you come into contact with children with different conditions, just to keep your thinking fresh. This final slide is a quick oversight to something that is known as Makaton. This is a communication tool, and we will provide you with a much detailed handout to help you with this. Many children with SEND use Makaton as a form of supporting communication or their main core communication. So this would be something that you should try and learn and have ready up your sleeve for when you need it.